Chapter 42. Jack and Hiccup Go Honeymooning. Time seemed to slow down as the Snow Queen's remains were whisked away by the wind. His hand tinged where he touched her. Whatever he'd been holding back, he couldn't feel it anymore. She was gone. He got up and ran. The wind carried him to Hiccup, Jamie, and Toothless, and he landed a meter away. Toothless nudged Hiccup's shoulder, and for once Jack wished he wasn't as expressive as he was. He made a thin noise, looking up at Jack. Jamie's cheeks were wet, his breath coming in short gasps. "Jack!" he croaked. "Jack!" It was Astrid. Jack didn't turn, but he could hear Stormfly in the other dragon's land. In a moment, she'd rushed past him to Hiccup's side and put her head on his chest. "No," she said, her voice far away. "No, no." Jamie still looked at Jack. He expected him to fix this. Jack felt himself walk forward and sit down beside Astrid. His hand moved on its own, and he unwillingly pressed it against Hiccup's heart. Why? He wasn't sure. He didn't want to feel the lack of a heartbeat. But his hand touched Hiccup's chest, and Hiccup's whole body jolted. Like emerging from water, the sounds around him flooded back into his ears. Astrid gasped, and Jack pulled his hand back, too confused and scared to do anything but stare as some strands in Hiccup's hair began to rise, and then his eyelids twitched and slowly opened. He grimaced, groaning weakly. "What?" he started. "Ow." Jamie gave a squeak that could have rivaled Baby Tooth. "You restarted his heart," he whispered. What?" Jack croaked. Nobody answered. They all just stared at Hiccup like he was a ghost. Hiccup was still too out of it to notice. Then Toothless jumped up and down on the spot and licked Hiccup's face, breaking the stunned pause. "Oh, okay," Hiccup said, a faint laugh in his voice. He blinked up at them. Somehow, he looked the least confused of all of them. He was probably too disoriented to feel much of anything at all. "Can someone—" Astrid leaned down and collected him in a fierce hug. "You were dead," Jack heard her whisper. "Your heart wasn't beating." Hiccup winced, but it didn't stop his eyes from widening. "But how—" he started, his eyes going to Jack. Then they moved to something behind Jack, and he frowned again. "Where's the Snow Queen?" Jack looked over his shoulder to see the other dragon riders still watching the scene in stunned silence. By the time he turned back, Astrid had let Hiccup go and was busy hiding her face so that nobody could see her wipe at her cheeks. She... Jack started, his voice wavering. Awareness was slowly returning to Hiccup's face, and now it softened in understanding. He reached for Jack's hand, but Jack pulled it away. Don't touch me. I don't know." He found it hard to breathe. "I don't know what happened, but I shocked you and your heart was... But if I touch you again, maybe it would stop again." I don't think that's how it works, Jack," Jamie said. "How do you know?" He shrugged. "I've seen it on TV." Astrid sniffled. "Where's TV?" "I'll handle this," came Toughnut's sudden loud voice, and before Jack could stop him, he'd grabbed his hand. Nothing happened. Toughnut groaned, throwing up his arms. "Oh, come on!" Jack stared at him. Then he began to laugh. He closed his eyes, letting his head loll forward. "It's done," he mumbled, too tired to rejoice. "She's gone. The Snow Queen is gone." There was silence. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Astrid smiling at him. "Berg is safe," she said. "No deaths, only some damage, but we're used to that." Hiccup pushed himself up, and Jamie helped him. "I take it your plan went a bit pear-shaped," he said, smiling at Jamie. He held up his hand for a high five. Jamie complied, but did it very softly. "You're not getting off the hook," Jack promised. "Neither of you." Jamie snorted. "You sound like my mom." Jack opened his mouth to retort, but something made him falter. He tilted his head to the side, feeling like someone was staring at the back of his head. He turned around, and though he only saw ice, he understood. He got to his feet, ignoring his aching, everything. "I have to talk to someone," he said tiredly. "Hold on," Hiccup said, and raised his arm to Jack. "I'll come with you." Jack hesitated. "Can you walk?" he asked, carefully taking Hiccup's hand. "Guess we'll see." He pulled him up, and Hiccup's eyes glazed over for a second. Jack steadied him, and Toothless hurried to his side, ready to catch him. "I'm good," Hiccup said after a few seconds, his voice strained with pain. Jamie appeared beside Jack, and the four of them trudged in the general direction of nothing, the ice steady beneath them. Jack kept a hand on Hiccup's back in case he'd suddenly collapse, though there was also a risk that Jack himself would suddenly collapse. "Stay here," Jack said when they'd gotten far enough away from the others. He took a step forward and pointed his staff at the ice in front of them. It cracked open with a thunder-like noise. As the ice floes floated apart, a familiar but not too friendly face appeared in the water. Udrul looked neither happy nor sad about their victory, but she wouldn't have been here if you weren't aware of it. She looked at Jack and nodded once. "You did well." Jack wasn't touching the water, but he understood her nonetheless. Another perk of being magic again, if he could call it a perk. "My fairy," Jack replied coldly. Udrul narrowed her eyes, but if she had any problems with Jack's attitude, she seemed to deem it wise not to voice them. Normally, Jack would have been uncomfortable with the newfound awe she had for him, but right now he was too tired to care, and these mermaids had never been anything but a nuisance. "Now," Jack said. Udrul waved her hand, and with no more warning, a colorful blob shot out of the black water. Babytooth looked around in confusion first, and then she saw Jack, and she let out the most exhilarated squeak Jack had ever heard from her. She flew right at Jack, darting around his head and into his face and chest. Jack couldn't help but laugh. "You're okay," he said. It felt like another layer of sky had been lifted from his shoulders. Babytooth continued to babble, too fast for Jack to understand, and went to greet Jamie, then Hiccup, then Toothless. Jamie pressed her gently to his forehead, and Hiccup looked just as happy about seeing her again. Then she went back to Jack, gestured wildly at him, and pulled at his hair. "Ouch! Yeah, I know, I'm aware," Jack laughed. "Yes, Babytooth, we did it." "So you did," Udrul said. Jack had almost forgotten she was there. "We thank you." Jack sent her an unimpressed look. "You're welcome," he said, before swinging his staff at her. Udrul disappeared under the water as if something had pulled her, and the water refroze. He huffed and turned to the others. "That felt good." Jamie stared with fascination at the newly frozen ice. Hiccup smiled fondly at Jack. "You look good," he said, before hearing himself. "I mean, you look better. You look, less like a corpse," Jack replied. He smiled. "Yeah, I feel better, I think." His voice faltered, and he had to look away. "All I was holding back, the Snow Queen got the full force of it when you... He trailed off, and there were a few seconds of silence. "You sure she's dead?" Hiccup asked softly. Jack glanced up at him and nodded. Hiccup's eyes were sympathetic. He took Jack's hand and squeezed it, but didn't say anything. They were all too tired to talk about anything that had to do with their quest, now due to end. Jack looked back towards the others. The twins were jumping on the ice, testing its thickness in a way that made Jack's stomach twist. Thankfully, it looked like Fishlegs managed to convince them to stop. Snotlout looked like he was trying to impress Astrid again. Astrid, even from this distance, looked thoroughly unimpressed. She kept sending curious glances in their direction. Jack didn't understand how they all acted so like themselves. Behind them, the fog was quickly letting up. Berg came back into view. The storm was over, and as if the gods wanted to give them definite assurance of it, the clouds parted and pale sunlight filtered through. "It's day," Jamie observed. "It always comes around at some point," Hiccup replied. Jack was just as surprised. The battle hadn't lasted that long at all. He looked up at the clouds, squinting at the light. "I have to go," he said. "Alva still has that fairy problem." "Jack," Hiccup and Jamie said at the same time, with the same exasperated tone. Jamie took his free hand and started pulling them back towards the island. "Whatever we have to do next, I'm sure can wait a few days," he said. Jack frowned at him, and Jamie just smiled, like he knew something Jack didn't. The following hours were a mess. Hiccup urged Jack to take a nap, first of all. He saw him off at Gothi's, and then steeled himself to go see Stoic. He'd run off earlier, defying orders again. Stoic had to be getting used to it at this point, but Hiccup knew he'd get a scolding anyway. However, turns out Stoic dreaded seeing Hiccup just as much, judging by the way he grudgingly admitted to being wrong about the attack. While they gave no indication he believed there was any magic involved, they accepted each other's apology and proceeded with their chiefly and son of the chiefly duties. After going through the village and noting down everything that needed to be fixed and done, Jamie and Hiccup searched the island for the Changewing. They didn't find her. Hiccup assured Jamie that that was just the nature of the Changewings. He'd never before met a Changewing that was so attached to a human as this one was to Jamie, and that she'd probably just returned home when the battle ended. "I've decided what I want to call her," Jamie said. Valkyrie. Isn't that cool? Hiccup decided not to argue that the Valkyries only appear after death, which wasn't really a good thing since Jamie didn't seem the type to yearn for glorious death in battle. He just grinned and said it was cool. The villagers were confused, to say the least. But as true Burkians, they ventured head first into the swamp that was their confusion and uncertainty about this new knowledge of the world. And Hiccup had no doubt they would come out stronger and even more boar-headed on the other side. They talked about magic, sadly not in a fond way, but who could blame them? A small part of Hiccup was glad they wouldn't remember it for long. A really small, minuscule part. A few hours later, he flew up to Gothi's hut and carefully entered. The hut was quiet except for the creaking of the floor. Gothi was in the great hall tending to the wounded, and her dragons followed her everywhere. Babytooth was with Jamie, and there was no crackling or fire from the hearth either, which for once had been left cold and unattended. Lying on the same fur he'd been giving his first day was Jack, sprawled on his back and completely oblivious to the world. His head tilted to the side, and his mouth was ajar. He wasn't snoring. Hiccup wasn't even sure he was breathing at first, but upon closer inspection he could see the slight rise and fall of his chest. His hand rested on his staff as he slept, so it was clear he hadn't moved at all since lying down. Hiccup motioned for Toothless to be quiet, then walked over as carefully as he could and kneeled beside Jack. He wondered if he should wake him up. The dragon riders didn't know where Jack was, no matter how much they had pestered Hiccup to tell him, but Hiccup had no doubt they would soon figure it out on their own. Better to wake up slowly and comfortably than with a bunch of excitable, sleep-deprived, and most likely rude questions. Hiccup lay down beside Jack. He gently brushed a few white strands out of his face. Being so out of it, he didn't expect Jack to open his eyes. The blue of his irises still caught Hiccup off guard, but he was slowly getting used to it. "Sorry," Hiccup whispered, letting his hand fall. "You don't have to wake up yet." Jack blinked blearily. "Has it been 4 days again?" he asked, voice scratchy. "Only a few hours," Hiccup chuckled. Jack's mouth quirked upwards. He moved sluggishly to put his hand over Hiccup's. It was cold. Hiccup wasn't used to it yet, but he didn't mind either. "Your injuries?" "Shallow. Nothing to worry about," Hiccup reassured him. Jack hummed. "That's good. Are you taking a nap too?" "I wasn't planning on it." "You were just planning on staring at me while I sleep?" Hiccup snorted. "I just wanted to see you." The gleam in Jack's eyes lost some of its impishness, and he looked away. He kept smiling, though, softly and serenely. "Can I come closer?" he asked after a few seconds. Hiccup frowned. "Why would you ask?" Jack sent him a look that was both exasperated and self-conscious. "Don't think you'll like cuddling up to a walking icicle, so I thought I'd give you the choice." "Psst," Hiccup said, rolling his eyes. He scooted closer to Jack, mindful of their respective injuries, and nestled up to him. "I'm a Viking. It'll take more than a little cold to scare me off." Jack's eyes crinkled at the corners. He intertwined his fingers with Hiccup's. Soon enough, they both drifted off to sleep. Jamie looked up at Gothi's hut, wishing Valkyrie had stayed a little longer. At least he wouldn't have needed to walk up the entire way, which was why he hadn't done it earlier. But as he stood staring up with dismay, Roughnut and Toughnut came up to each side of him. "Need a ride?" Toughnut asked. Jamie should have known they had ulterior motives. By the time he knocked on Gothi's door, he looked back and saw that they had been followed. The dragon riders jumped one by one onto the balcony, and Jamie sent the twins a baleful look. He didn't get to say anything before the door opened, though. It was Hiccup, wearing a pinched expression. "I was wondering where you were," he said dryly. "They tricked me," Jamie complained. "Yes, that's what they do." Jack appeared behind Hiccup's shoulder then. He looked tired, but his face lit up anyway. "You all seem all right," he said, making space for himself in the door. There was an awkward pause. Jack sighed, his smile turning exasperated. "You already know what I am. There's no point in acting surprised now," he said, and nodded for them to come inside. "Get the questions over with. Though I'm happy to not be invisible anymore, the staring can get a bit annoying in the long run." Jamie shared a look with Hiccup, who just shrugged. "You heard him," Jamie said, tilting his chin up before following Jack inside. The dragon riders filed in. The next couple of hours were spent answering the same questions Hiccup had asked the first time he got filled in on the whole magic thing, and then questions about Jack Frost specifically. "So, are you, like, a ghost?" Snotlout asked slowly. Hiccup's brows furrowed, and he opened his mouth, obviously about to scold him for being so rude, but Jack just snorted. Maybe, I don't know, he admitted. I haven't met a ghost before, so maybe ghosts are just a concept humans came up with because they couldn't explain other magic stuff. Who knows? You don't sound very knowledgeable about spirits, despite being one, Fishlegs commented. Jack shrugged. It's all a very mysterious affair, he said. We don't have fancy spirit cards with stats or whatever. He smiled playfully at him. Huh, Jamie said. What would your stats be? There was a pause. Fishlegs cleared his throat uncertainly. There's strength, speed, firepower, venom, stealth, armor. I'm not a dragon, Jack interrupted with a laugh. Hiccup tilted his head thoughtfully to the side. Strength, speed, stealth, venom. Maybe not exactly firepower. Venom? Jack said. Your words can be pretty scathing. Armor, Jamie said, petting Freya's cloak. Besides, you can take a hit. I've seen you fall from the sky multiple times. I was actually wondering what that cloak was, Astrid said. Hiccup, Jack, and Jamie went very quiet. Babytooth chirped confusedly. Oh, right, Jack exclaimed suddenly, making several of them jump, and turned to Babytooth. They can't see you yet, can they? Except Rough and Tough, of course. Hey, guys, do you want to hear what the deal was with those missing teeth? Which was more than enough to distract them. It took about 5 minutes of Jack explaining the whole thing before Fishlegs suddenly made a squeak that, appropriately enough, sounded a lot like Babytooth, and pointed at the fairy resting on Jack's head. And then it was like a domino effect. After another 5 minutes of freaking out and Babytooth looking both flattered and uncomfortable with the attention, the gang calmed down enough for Hiccup to get a word in edgewise. That took a lot less time than convincing you Jack wasn't dead, he said. Astrid snorted. Fairies, even teeth-obsessed ones, are not so hard to believe in compared to the rest. We've seen the weirdest stuff already. It was Jack's turn to snort. You should meet my friends. A horn sounded just then, but none of them immediately stirred. Thought we'd skip dinner today, Astrid said, looking at the others for answers. Nah, Toughnut said. Just got delayed. People still want to celebrate. Who has the energy for that? Roughnut mumbled. Jack grimaced. You really must be exhausted, he said. The dragon riders got to their feet, all except Hiccup. You're not going to join? Snotlout asked, looking between the three of them, even at Babytooth. Hiccup looked at Jack, who visibly hesitated. I think I'll skip, but you two should go, he said to Hiccup and Jamie. You're probably hungry. Astrid shifted from foot to foot. We can cover for you if, anything weird happens. It's not that, Jack said with a grateful smile. But thanks. It's crowded down there and I don't... He seemed to struggle finding the right words. Jamie touched his arm lightly. Let's just stay here, he said. Hiccup can get food. There was no argument. Hiccup herded his friends out, and Jamie and Jack waited in the hut while Hiccup and Toothless fetched dinner. When he got back and served Jamie mutton chops again, he envied Jack for not needing to eat. Still, he ate it all in less than 5 minutes and felt a lot better afterwards. Are you cold? Jack asked at some point. When none of them answered, he rolled his eyes and got to his feet. Why didn't you say anything? Hiccup, can I borrow your sword? Hiccup sent him a long look. As long as you grab the handle, he said, taking Inferno out. Are you sure this is a good idea? Maybe not, Jack said, but took the sword anyway. Jamie watched curiously as he walked over to the hearth and ignited Inferno. The heat made him grimace, but moments later the fire crackled softly. Jack grinned victoriously and came back to sit. He handed Inferno back to Hiccup, who took it, but without looking away from Jack, his eyes scrutinizing. It's not bad for you? He asked. You were always so wary around fire in the beginning. Jack shrugged. It's bearable, he said. And you look cold. And, figured we might as well make ourselves comfortable, because there's some things we have to talk about. Jamie's stomach twisted. He dared glancing at Hiccup, but his face was a stony mask. Jack didn't look much better, but he reached into his satchel, covering his hand with his cloak. His own cloak, that is, not Freya's. What came out of the satchel wasn't a bunch of crystal pieces, though, but one whole crystal. I don't know why it's whole. Well, almost, Jack said, turning it around to show them one jagged cavity. But I have a feeling there aren't many visions left. Jamie looked at his hands. Let's wait a few days, he said, before he realized he'd had the thought. Jack and Hiccup both looked at him, Hiccup with a hint of hope, and Jack with a hint of suspicion. "Jamie," he started, "I just think that even if it was all unintentional, we should stay behind and make sure that the village is okay before we leave," Jamie said reasonably, folding his hands like important people on TV would sometimes do when talking about serious things. "We owe them that." Hiccup's lips twitched with amusement. "That's very kind of you, Jamie, but we've been rebuilding our village on a sometimes weekly basis for years," he said. "This isn't even that bad in comparison." "Well, it would still make me feel better," Jamie mumbled. "And I want to spend more time here with my friends. I want to appreciate that this place has dragons without having to worry about anything else. Once we leave, we're not coming back, so—" He nodded resolutely. "I don't want to leave yet." Jack's eyes softened. "Are you sure?" he asked. Jamie smiled and nodded again. "Well," Jack said, ruffling Jamie's hair, "I still have to go to Alva's Island. I'll leave tomorrow. It won't take long." The last part was to Hiccup, who had begun to protest. "Really, half a day, probably less." Hiccup squinted. "I thought you were kidding when you said you could reach Burke in minutes," he said. "It was maybe a slight exaggeration, but not too far off," Jack said. "Being Jack Frost is busy work." Babytooth made an unimpressed noise, and Jack rolled his eyes. "But not as busy as being the Tooth Fairy," he said diligently. Hiccup laughed. "Okay, speaking of your weird family," he said, "I would like to know some more about that North guy you keep mentioning. Actually, I'd like to know more about all of them." Jack brightened. "I've told you about him before, you just didn't know I was talking about him," he said. "I did mention a guy climbing down chimneys, right? Jamie, why don't you tell him?" Jamie grinned at Hiccup's bewildered expression, and just like that, the heavy topic of their home journey got put on hold for a few days longer. Jack had to ask Jamie a couple more times just to be sure he wasn't doing this out of guilt. And though it became clear that Jamie really did feel a certain responsibility for Burke and that he wasn't ready to leave just yet, it also eventually became clear that letting Jack and Hiccup have more time together was part of that plan. Jack knew this because of what happened just before he left for Alva's Island. He and Jamie stood on the little cliff where they used to sit, out of view from the village, and Jack had just asked Jamie one last time if he didn't just want to go home once Jack returned from Alva. He didn't, and the topic came to a stop when Toothless and Hiccup suddenly landed on the edge of the cliff. "Jack," Hiccup said, sounding relieved, "I thought you'd left." Jack raised his brows in question. "I was about to," he said. "Something wrong?" "Yes, I was lying in bed trying to convince myself that you know what you're doing," Hiccup recounted. "And then I remembered that that is rarely the case, and I know it usually works out anyway. But even if you do have magic powers now, I can't let you face those fairies alone. What if something goes wrong?" "Something usually goes wrong," Jamie said, before Jack could protest that that wasn't going to happen. Babytooth chirped in agreement. "I don't just have magical powers," Jack said. "I'm currently the most powerful magical entity in the entire archipelago. I'll be fine." "Well, so thought the Snow Queen, until you suddenly fell out of the sky. So who knows what's going to happen?" Hiccup argued. "I want to come with you." Jack opened his mouth to argue back, but then had a sudden mental image of the five of them on an adventure again. Sure, it had been perilous, but there had been many wonderful moments too. He couldn't lie and say he wouldn't miss it. "That's a long journey," he said slowly. "It would take me hours. It would take us days." "I've already packed," Hiccup said, patting the saddle, to which a couple of bags were tied. "Besides, this time we have a definite goal. We don't have to stop at every island, get ambushed by fairy tale creatures, or get lost in enchanted mountains. It'll be a breeze." "You say, right after saying anything could go wrong," Jack snorted. "Actually, he has a point," Jamie said, shifting his weight. "But I think I want to stay here. You can go without me." Jack raised his brows. "Really? That's not like you." Jamie pursed his lips and shrugged, not quite meeting his eyes. "I want to hang out with Brand and the others," he said. "If you find Valkyrie, say hi from me. Oh, and Babytooth, could you stay here as well?" Babytooth seemed okay, if not a little confused with that. There was a small pause. Jack glanced at Hiccup, who seemed to realize the same thing Jack was thinking. Jack leaned on his staff, peering at Jamie. "So it would just be the two of us?" he inquired. Toothless gave an annoyed grumble. Jamie feigned surprise. "Oh, I didn't think about that. he said, obviously lying. I guess so. It will be lighter for Toothless anyway. You should get going. It's a long journey. Hiccup smiled, fondly shaking his head. Yeah, Jack, he said. Come on. Wait, Jamie suddenly yelped, taking Jack's arm. Give me the crystal. Jack automatically covered the satchel with his arm. What? Why? Jamie looked exasperated. No, I'm not going to destroy it or anything. I couldn't do that to my mom. But you don't need it, do you? I don't want you to think about it. You should just have some responsibility-free fun for once. Jack was a little offended. For once? He repeated. Just give me the satchel, Jamie said, holding his palm out. Jack huffed, but untied the belt around his waist, handing the satchel to Jamie. Okay, then, he said, and leaned down to hug him. You're enjoying this way too much, he mumbled to him before pulling away. I don't know what you're talking about, Jamie said with a satisfied smirk. He waved at Hiccup. Good luck. And off he ran. Babytooth looked between them, shrugged helplessly, then sped after Jamie. Jack looked after them for a few seconds. For some reason, it was a bit hard to turn around and look at Hiccup, but he managed it eventually. Hiccup's lips were pulled into a thin line, and when he met Jack's eyes, he laughed sheepishly. Jack felt himself smile too, and he looked away, embarrassed. Right, he said, lifting himself off the ground. Let's go then. He darted off. No, he wasn't running away. They just had a long journey ahead of them. Unlike the first time he'd set out on this journey, this time he felt magical auras coming from every direction. Some stronger than others. Mostly just from nature sprites going about their business, but the archipelago was alive with it. It was nearly overwhelming. Jack couldn't believe he hadn't noticed it before. From here, he could tell the fastest way to Alva's Island wasn't the path they had taken the first time around, but Hiccup and Toothless would need a place to rest. A night under the open sky was unavoidable, but they could at least limit it as much as possible by staying the night at Edon and Ruins. Might as well follow the same route. Toothless caught up with him and rudely smacked Jack with his wing. Jack yelped and spun out of the path for a moment before steadying himself. Hey, wait up a little, Hiccup laughed. Jack floated up in front of them, flying backwards. Wait up? I thought night furies were supposed to be fast, he said, tapping Toothless's nose. You wanted to come with, so you better keep up. Whoa, okay, Hiccup said, slowly beginning to grin. When did you get so cocky? Always was, Jack replied. If we hurry, we can make it to Edon and Ruins by evening. We'll sleep there, then travel onwards in the morning, and hopefully we'll find somewhere to crash that isn't an enchanted island next. Hiccup made a mock-impressed face. You're making plans, he said. Never thought I'd see the day. Also, he grimaced, how will we make it to Alva's Island without getting lost in that whole time-warped space? If the mermaids can navigate it, so can I, Jack said. Probably. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Ah, there's the Jack I know. Hey, it was your choice to come with me. Yes, Hiccup said, his eyes gleaming as he smiled at Jack. If our time is limited, then I don't want to miss a second of it. Jack looked back at him, trying and failing to come up with a witty reply to that. In the back of his head, he heard Jamie's voice saying, Cliché. He looked away, unable to stop smiling, before darting up above Hiccup. He didn't quite land on Toothless, but cupped Hiccup's cheek, kissing him quick. Hiccup seemed abruptly speechless, which was the point. Jack grinned before flying ahead again, looking over his shoulder. You gonna hurry up or what? He yelled. Toothless, I know you can do better than that. Toothless seemed to scowl at him and started beating his wings faster. Hiccup's eyes glinted with winning instinct. The wind was in Jack's ears, so he couldn't hear what he said to Toothless, but he saw him change the gear in the tail fin, and suddenly they shot forwards. Jack yelped and leaped out of the way before darting after them. Either he'd overestimated how fast he was as Jack Frost, or he'd underestimated how fast a night fury could move if he wanted to. What was that about keeping up? Hiccup yelled. Jack put his arms to his sides and shot forward. Behind them, Burke was already just a shadow on the horizon. Wind! He yelled, and the wind picked up around them, lifting both Jack and Toothless along with it. It spun Jack around like a snowflake, the surge pulling an elated yell from him. The clouds and the ocean became a blur, and Jack led it, knowing the wind knew where he wanted to go. It didn't take too long before the race unraveled into a game of tag or something reminiscent of it. They kept moving in the vague direction of the marketplace, but it probably would have been faster if they'd stopped sabotaging each other and making competitions out of who could do the coolest tricks, or if Jack managed to resist the urge of annoying Toothless into chasing him. When they passed over the lean-to they'd stopped before, they decided to calm down as to not completely exhaust Toothless, and, though Jack didn't like to admit it himself, he couldn't hide how breathless he was as he settled down behind Hiccup and leaned against him. Hiccup bumped his head softly against Jack's. "Joy suits you," he told him. Jack smiled softly. "It suits most people," he replied. He turned around and put his chin on Hiccup's shoulder. "Competitiveness suits you." Hiccup snorted. "Thanks," he said. They sat quietly for a bit before Hiccup reached back and found Jack's hand, moving it around his own waist and intertwining their fingers. Jack didn't say anything, but he squeezed his hand back. When they finally got to the marketplace, all three of them were close to collapsing. Hiccup's chest and both of his legs ached, and though Jack didn't say anything about it, he could see how stiff his gait was, as if every step hurt him. He'd say something about healing quickly, but it seemed even winter spirits needed at least a few days to fully recover. Eden and Rune looked surprised to see Hiccup so soon. They asked why he was on his own, and he felt bad about lying about it. Jack just smiled and shook his head, silently telling him it was all right, but it still felt wrong. Hiccup wondered what it was for him to be invisible again after being human for so long. Once they were up in the usual sleeping spot, Hiccup took Jack's hand again. "This stinks," he said, very romantically, he was sure. Jack's chuckle was wry and half-hearted. "It could be worse." Toothless huddled up in one corner and was the first to start snoring. Hiccup wrapped himself in furs and blankets and sent Jack a look. "I know you don't feel cold, but it's still cold to look at you," he said. "I can put the cloaks back on if it makes you more comfortable," Jack suggested, and yawned as he sat down beside him. "Or if you're not too cold." He trailed off, glancing at the heap of blankets that covered Hiccup. Hiccup's lips quirked upwards. He opened the blankets to let Jack in, and they settled back against the wall. He heard Jack give the slightest of sighs and smiled contentedly, burying his nose in Jack's hair. "Is this what you're supposed to do in a relationship?" Jack mumbled after a couple of comfortably quiet minutes. "Don't ask me," Hiccup said. "I only barely had a girlfriend at 15. It hardly counts." He was quiet for another few seconds, frowning into the dim light. "Are we in a relationship?" he asked, keeping his voice down. Jack tilted his head up. The lantern cast dark shadows across his face, but his eyes were still bright blue. "You were the one to say boyfriend first," he pointed out. "It feels right, don't you think?" "It does," Hiccup quickly said. "It's just—" He didn't really want to say it, but Jack understood anyway. He sighed again and put his head back on Hiccup's shoulder. "We're together now," he said quietly, "as long as it lasts. And then—" He trailed off. "I might not remember, but you will," Hiccup said. "If you feel threatened by potential suitors, then don't worry. The tooth fairies are charming, but I don't like them in that way." Hiccup couldn't hear if he was joking or not. He ran a hand slowly up and down Jack's back. "I don't really care what we are," Jack eventually said, and reached up to run his fingertips up Hiccup's neck, making a light shiver run down his spine. "As long as it is whatever this is, right here and right now, just us two." He paused, "and the snoring dragon in the corner." On behalf of the snoring dragon in the corner, Hiccup held his laugh back. Jack looked up at him, smiling. He straightened to put both his hands on each of Hiccup's cheek, running his thumb across his cheekbone. He looked like he wanted to say something, but for whatever reason stayed silent for several seconds. Hiccup was quiet too and closed his eyes, leaning into his touch. "In the past months, I've seen moments from my past in haphazard order," Jack started softly. "It makes me wonder what time really is, if it's linear or if each moment exists in its own present. It's comforting to think about it." Hiccup opened his eyes. "How so?" Jack's eyes traveled down Hiccup's face. "Because then maybe a part of us will always be here," he murmured, "and this moment won't ever end. Even when we've moved on, I'll know that there's still a Jack and Hiccup somewhere in the universe, existing just like this forever." His lower lip quivered a little, and he looked back up at Hiccup. "Does that make sense?" Hiccup could only nod. He exhaled shakily before closing what was left of the distance between them. He brought his hand to Jack's neck, closing his eyes as he felt Jack melt against him. It took a long time before they finally allowed themselves to fall asleep. Jack felt all but healed the next day, physically and mentally. Idun saw Hiccup off with some extra food, and then they were flying away from the marketplace in a slightly different direction than last time. Jack knew exactly where to go. The fairy's aura was like a headlight glaring him in the face, and they took it easy, switching between talking and flying in relaxing silence. Jack also switched between sailing on the wind and sitting on Toothless's back, leaning contentedly against Hiccup. It took many hours, and it was long dark when Jack noticed the shift in the air, betraying they'd entered into the fairy's territory. And he was right. He could tell which way to go. He flew back to Hiccup and Toothless. "Do you feel that?" he asked, flying backwards in front of them. Hiccup looked around, then shook his head. "Do you still see the trail in the ocean or something? Because I have no idea where to go," he said. Jack frowned in concentration. "Hold on a minute," he said, before heading up to the clouds. He raised his staff and felt a vibration go through the whiteness, springing out from him in every direction. He felt his magic fight against the magic of the fairies. They could probably feel that something was coming. When he headed back down, it had started to snow. He landed softly on Toothless's back and leaned on Hiccup's shoulder, pointing ahead. The snowflakes flurried together and glowed a faint white blue. No matter how far they flew, the distance between themselves and the glow remained the same, always pointing towards the southeast. "Do you see it?" Jack asked. Hiccup's mouth hung open. "Yeah, I see it," he said. "It's pretty." "Thank you," Jack said, bumping his head against Hiccup's. "Keep it in front of you. We're headed straight towards Alva's Island now." Though this trip went a lot faster than the first time around, they still had to stop for the night before they reached Alva's Island. Hiccup worried about accidentally disappearing for months again, but Jack assured him the enchantment didn't affect them, not now that the archipelago was under his protection. After spending so long worrying that his powers weren't enough, it felt good to be sure of something. They made a campfire. For once, Jack refused to cuddle up to Hiccup because it was already cold enough sleeping outside. Though Jack couldn't make it any warmer, he could at least push the winter away, creating a dome of slightly less freezing weather. Camping under the open sky wasn't the same as last time, but Jack still treasured it. The next day, Alva's Island appeared on the horizon so quickly it was almost anticlimactic. It still took them some hours, but compared to how much trouble they went through to get there last time, it seemed almost too easy. And as Alva's Island came into view, so did the Fairies' Island. Jack flew beside Toothless, watching the island warily, as if it would disappear any second. That would be just as well. He was only planning on telling them to move anyway. Jack didn't want to take any more lives, but hopefully they would think twice about terrorizing someone like this again. Jack might be leaving, but the fairies didn't need to know that. Hiccup and Toothless had to wait on Alva's Island, since the fairies' magic still affected Toothless. Jack watched them land, but headed straight for the fairies' island himself. Better to get this over with. He expected to feel something when he got closer. Something like what he'd felt when the Snow Queen came to Berg. A kind of vibration in the air, sending shivers upon shivers down his spine. But there was nothing. The fairies' island was still shrouded in fog. Jack raised his staff and swung it. The wind picked up suddenly, and like blowing dust off an untouched surface, the fog got washed away, revealing the forest in all its glory. Jack didn't feel the need to walk through it again. He soared over the treetops and up to the side of the mountain until the fairies' valley appeared below him. He couldn't see the fairies, but he knew they were there, hiding from him. After what they did, and knowing what they had been doing to the people on Alva's Island for years, he didn't feel too bad about it. "I'm giving you one chance to leave this place and release your power over this part of the archipelago," Jack called down. Even from this distance, he knew the fairies heard him, or rather, understood his intention, just like the fairies had communicated with them. "And if I find out you've trapped someone else under your spell, it won't end well for you. And trust me, I will find out." It wasn't intentional, but as he said it, the clouds flashed above him. Thunder rolled across the sky. And just like that, the island below him seemed to dim. The falling snow finally reached the ground, covering grass and leaves that quickly lost its enchanted glow. In a matter of minutes, all Jack was seeing was the average nature of the archipelago. The wind settled, and the island was slowly painted white. It was a little sad, in a way. The forest had been one of the most beautiful things Jack had ever seen. But he only had to remember its purpose, and it wasn't that sad anymore. The fairies were gone. Jack flew back to Alva's island. Jack could see the faint shapes of people going about their day in the village. If they noticed anything different, they didn't show it. He supposed it was a change they'd discover gradually. As he approached the docks, he saw 3 figures waiting for him: Toothless, Hiccup, and Alva. He tried swallowing down his apprehension, but his hand still shook with it as he came closer. Then Alva suddenly looked up at him, and her face lit up with surprise. "There!" she shrieked, pointing at him. Jack felt his own face break into a smile. He landed on the pier and laughed as Alva ran up to him, not even hesitating before throwing her arms around him. She quickly pulled back, keeping her hands on his shoulders and looking him up and down. "That's how you were telling the truth," she stammered. Jack grinned. "Well, you must have believed me, since you can see me," he said. Hiccup and Toothless came up behind her, Hiccup looking just as happy as Jack felt. "Your powers did return then," Alva said, letting her hands fall. "And you can fly and make it snow. That's so... I have no words." She brought her hands to her head before seemingly sobering up a little. Did you do what we talked about?" Jack nodded. He closed his eyes and willed the weather to let up. The snow gradually got thinner and the clouds dispersed, letting the moon lie down. On the horizon, several shapes appeared. More land than what they'd seen from this exact spot the last time they were here. Hiccup came up to Alva's side, putting a hand on her shoulder. "What do you feel?" he asked. "Do you still feel content with what you have?" Alva's eyes were wide as they moved along the horizon. She gave a breathy laugh. "How strange," she murmured. She smiled at both Hiccup and Jack. "I'll tell Dad later. He'll feel it too, won't he? This pull to explore?" Hiccup grinned, looking very excited on her behalf. "That's the idea," Jack said. "The fairies are gone. You're free." "Free," Alva repeated dreamily. "Yes, I think you're right." They stayed with Alva the rest of the day, and she housed them for the night. Her father came in briefly to check what she was up to, and there was another awkward moment of pretending nothing was amiss. Alva began trying to convince her dad that Jack was there, but Jack quickly told her she shouldn't do that. He didn't want to be the cause of mistrust towards Alva's mental state. Still, Hiccup could tell Jack appreciated the effort. While Jack dealt with the fairies, Alva had, evidently by accident, since she'd slapped her hand in front of her mouth right after, revealed that Jack had told her about Jack Frost during their last visit. Hiccup couldn't pretend that didn't make him a little bit jealous, but he understood Jack's train of thought. Back then, Alva had just been someone he would probably never meet again, so her reaction to finding out his secret wasn't such a big deal. Jack told him later that he hadn't meant to tell her at all, but that she'd seen him trying to perform magic and put 2 and 2 together. And so they spent the rest of the day hanging around the island. Jack was not shy about showing off his powers, and when it came to riding Toothless, Alva was a lot less fearful than Hiccup expected her to be. The same could not be said when Jack tried taking her for a spin. The morning came suddenly the next day, and they said their goodbyes at the pier. Alva looked sad to see them go, and hugged them both for a long time. "Don't suppose there's a chance I'll see you again?" she asked. Jack's shoulders sank. "I wouldn't count on it," he admitted. Alva took a deep breath, then let it out in a sigh. "Oh well," she said with a sad smile. "Then I'm at least glad to have met you, and thank you so much." As Alva's island became a shadow in the distance, Hiccup looked over at Jack. He flew quietly beside Toothless, looking vacantly at the ocean. "Jack," Hiccup said. Jack looked up, blinking as if he'd forgotten where he was. "Come over here." Jack obliged. He settled behind Hiccup and snagged his arms around his waist, letting out a shaky sigh. Hiccup took one of his hands, and they flew in silence for a while. A few hours went by before Jack suddenly perked up. "What is that?" Hiccup saw it a second later. A huge ice float in the middle of the ocean. Not only that, it seemed someone was standing on it. "Oh," Jack said in a small voice. "Oh?" Hiccup repeated. "What does oh mean?" "We should probably land," Jack said, before scoffing. "What am I talking about?" And then he jumped off Toothless and let himself fall towards the ice floe. Hiccup didn't know why he suddenly felt so nervous, but they followed him. As they came closer, Hiccup could see that it was a woman standing there. For a horrifying moment, he thought it was the Snow Queen, but it only took a second glance to see that aside from sharing a certain royal stance, she looked nothing like her. Toothless landed next to Jack, near the center of the ice floe, but still with a bit of distance between themselves and the woman. Jack was the first to speak. "You probably want this back," he said, taking off Freya's cloak. "Oh." Hiccup's mouth went suddenly dry. The woman, Freya, smiled, and Hiccup felt himself kneel. What else could he do? "He's a lot more polite than you," Freya said. Her voice was full yet soft, and somehow reminded Hiccup of the first waft of the springtime wind. "Please, Hiccup, you can stand." He wanted to ask her how she knew his name, but couldn't find his voice. He stood shakily, looking between Jack and the goddess. Freya, he stammered, nodding respectfully. Jack was smiling amusedly at him before turning back to the goddess. "Thank you," he said. "The Snow Queen is gone now, though I'm not sure if it would have happened if it weren't for your, nudge." The last word was delivered with a certain embarrassment, which was enough to push Hiccup out of his stupor. "The absence of her looming aura feels like a breath of fresh air," Freya said. "I just wanted to come see you in person, just to be sure. But I see now, it's true." She looked between the two of them, her eyes, one hazel brown and the other bright blue, glinting with something that looked like pride. "You can keep the cloak. I'm afraid I won't be needing it much longer." Jack's face fell. He looked down at the cloak, beginning to lower his arms, before walking up to the goddess and handing it to her. "Then hold on to it to the end," he said. Freya raised her brows. Hiccup couldn't imagine it was a good thing to refuse a gift from a goddess, but she just chuckled and accepted the cloak. She brought it around her shoulders, and though she was taller than Jack, it seamlessly adjusted itself to her height. "There's one piece left," Freya said. "Once you touch it, it will send you, Jamie, and Babytooth back to your time." Jack's jaw clenched, and he glanced at Hiccup. "What about the archipelago?" he asked. "I told the fairies they'd regret it if they tried trapping another island like they did to Alva and her people. But I'll be gone. Who will protect them?" Freya looked thoughtfully into the air. "I think you've scared them into hiding for at least a long while," she said. "And though your compassion is admirable, I'm afraid you have no choice but to let the archipelago fend for itself. But don't worry," she touched his arm lightly. "You've done a remarkable job, Jack. All of you." Hiccup jolted when she put her eyes on him. "The archipelago is in good hands," she said. Then she took a step back and let out a heavy sigh. "I can't stay here much longer. I wish you a safe home journey, Jack." Jack looked a bit confused, but he nodded. "Thank you." Freya smiled. "Thank you." Hiccup blinked, and she was gone, like she'd never been there at all. He let out a shaky breath, taking a hold of Toothless to steady himself. Jack turned to him, and his confused frown turned into a smirk. "What, never met a goddess before?" They returned to Berg within 4 days of their departure. This time, Hiccup had been careful explaining to Astrid what he was planning to do, so for once no one had reported anyone missing. And then the next few days passed way too quickly. Hiccup tried spending as much time with Jack and Jamie as possible, and he thanked the gods that the battle hadn't left the village too messed up. They spent most of the time away from the busiest part of the village, hanging out with the dragon riders or with the kids. Hiccup thought Jack was good with kids before, but as Jack Frost he was on a whole other level, and the kids would hardly leave him alone. He never looked like he minded, though. Hiccup checked his leg every now and then, hoping that whatever Jack did to the fairies, it would lift the curse. But every time he looked, his skin had the same moss-green tinge, and it ached a little, but not unbearably, to walk on it. His other injuries hurt more, but he'd been lucky. They'd all been lucky. They spent a bunch of time flying, sometimes with Jamie and Babytooth, sometimes with the whole Dragon Rider gang, and sometimes it was just Hiccup and Jack. Though the chaos that ensued when they were many was the cause of interesting shenanigans and uncontrollable laughing fits, Hiccup treasured the latter the most. 7 days after the battle with the Snow Queen, Hiccup woke up to see Jack looking out the window of his bedroom. The moon was up, and it was full. As if he noticed Hiccup's gaze on him, Jack turned around. He was holding a bundle of clothes in his arms. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Is something wrong?" Hiccup whispered, as to not wake the 3 others. Jack's lips trembled. He pressed them together and nodded. Hiccup gestured for him to join him, and Jack soundlessly tiptoed across the floor, sitting down next to Hiccup. Now that he was closer, Hiccup saw what he was holding. the clothes he and Jamie had arrived in. Hiccup's heart sank. He knew this would happen eventually, but he trained himself not to think about it for so long, he'd almost convinced himself Jack and Jamie leaving would forever be a problem for future Hiccup. "Jamie's getting restless," Jack murmured. "But it's not just that. The last time I spoke to the Guardians, they said they had the time fragment under control, but they can't hold it forever. Stretching the time out longer than we already have is selfish." He hung his head and sniffled, almost angrily. Hiccup didn't know what to say because Jack had a point. He just didn't want to admit it. He didn't want him to leave. He swallowed and brought his arms around Jack, leaning his chin on his shoulder. "It's time you go back, then," he heard himself whisper. He could feel Jack tremble, and he hugged him tighter. "Tomorrow," Jack managed to mumble. He turned around and leaned against Hiccup so that they both fell back into bed, nuzzling his face into Hiccup's neck. Hiccup felt his eyes sting, so he closed them. Jack started lightly brushing through his hair, and despite how hard his heart was beating, the motion still started lulling him back to sleep. He exhaled shakily and kissed Jack's forehead. "Tomorrow." Hiccup, Jack, and Jamie sat in a circle on the floor of Hiccup's room. Jamie was absently petting Toothless, and Baby Tooth sat atop Jack's head again, looking apprehensively at the crystal lying on the floor between them. "It's energized," Jack said, "by Snow's magic. It's sort of relieving. At least that means our magic wasn't the same, so..." He trailed off, and there was silence. "What happens when we leave?" Jamie asked quietly. "People are still healing. Won't they be confused?" "Baby Tooth says they'll..." Jack started, glancing at Hiccup. Hiccup tried for a smile and squeezed his hand. "We'll just assume it's because of a training drill, I guess," he said. "Or a brawl, or a flying accident. Lots of options here on Berk." "Yeah, your brains will figure it out," Jack mumbled. He looked at Hiccup again, his mouth opening and closing a couple of times. I guess this..." "Could I come with you?" Hiccup blurted. Jack and Jamie blinked at him. "I mean, into the vision thing," he clarified. "Not the future. I don't think that would be possible anyway." "What if it does send you to the future, though?" Jamie said. "This is the last one." "I don't think it will," Jack said. "Freya very specifically said our names." He pointed between himself, Jamie, and Baby Tooth, when she talked about the crystal. If the gods have some power of augury, maybe she saw this coming. Hiccup had a feeling he was just trying to rationalize it as an excuse to be together longer. He smiled, and Jack smiled right back, his eyes regaining some of its liveliness. "If you say so," Jamie said with a shrug. He looked back down at the crystal and took a deep breath. "Let's do it, then." Jack set his jaw. He reached over to Toothless and put his hand on his head. They'd already said their goodbyes earlier, but Jack sent Toothless one last smile. Toothless was the only one present who had been making no effort to conceal his sadness. His whole body slumped, his eyes falling shut as he leaned into Jack's touch. "I'll never forget you, okay?" Jack whispered. Toothless gave a soft whine in response. Retracting his hand, Jack forced himself to turn away, focusing on the crystal. "Okay," he said, then quickly touched it, like he was afraid he'd chicken out if he didn't do it now. Hiccup was prepared, catching him before he hit the floor. He made sure Jack's staff was in his hand before lying down himself. He counted to 3 with Jamie, and as last time, Hiccup blacked out the moment his fingers touched the crystal. When he woke up a second later, he was suddenly very cold. He pushed himself up and had to shield his face from the wind and snow. Jamie sat up next to him, looking just as disgruntled, while Jack stood completely unbothered a few meters away, looking around with a frown. "This is," he said, his voice dampened by the wind. "Berk," Hiccup realized. He quickly got to his feet, struggling to keep his balance in the blizzard. "Wait a minute. This is... isn't it?" Jack raised a brow. "Is what?" Hiccup looked up, just in time to spot 2 shapes struggling to fly through the storm. "Look over there," Jamie said, and pointed to what at first glance just looked like empty white landscape. But then Hiccup saw them, halfway buried in the snow. The 3 of them trudged towards them. Hiccup didn't know what to expect from these visions yet, so when he saw Jack and Jamie lying there, he had to look at the present Jack and Jamie to see whether or not this was normal. Judging by their expressions, it was somewhat surprising even to them. Hiccup knew there wasn't anything they could do to help, and that this was in the past. He knew Jack and Jamie would be okay, yet the sight still made his gut twist. Stormfly and Toothless landed nearby, and Hiccup saw himself and Astrid come running up. "Hello?" Past Hiccup called, and Hiccup cringed. Obviously, Jack and Jamie weren't going to answer. Toothless and Stormfly watched from afar. It was strange seeing their wariness now that they knew what had caused it. Jack still had magic left in him at this point. The blizzard was his doing. Hiccup shivered, and it wasn't due to the cold. He watched his past self as he crouched down to Jack, checking if he was alive, and jolting back when Jack suddenly grabbed his wrist. Then Astrid spotted Jamie. They quickly collected the two boys and hurried back on their dragons. Hiccup shifted as he watched them disappear. "Why do we feel cold when we're not really here?" he lamented, turning to Jack. Jack didn't seem to hear him at first. He was looking at his staff, twisting it absently. "Because we are here," he said, "a little bit." And then he looked up at the sky, closing his eyes. Immediately, Hiccup felt the wind begin to slow down, fading just as suddenly as it had blown up. He sent Jack a bewildered look. "I don't understand," he said. "Did you just change the past?" Jack looked back at him. "I don't think so," he said. "This is what happened, isn't it?" Hiccup frowned, thinking back. The storm had retreated quickly, even unnaturally so, but it was still confusing. "Where's the crystal, though?" Jamie asked. "Shouldn't it be here somewhere?" Hiccup hesitated, still confused. "I know where a crystal is," he said. "The one that I found, though maybe we won't be able to interact with it." Jack and Jamie exchanged a look before Jack nodded. "Where is it?" Now that the weather had let up, Hiccup had no problem navigating, even if he had found the crystal completely by chance. If it even was by chance. Now that he knew he had the ability to track down magic, maybe the pull of the crystal led him to it. The selfish part of him noted that if that was the case, then it was Hiccup's fault that Jack and Jamie were now about to disappear from his life forever. But he quickly shook that thought from his head. He was glad that they were going home. He was glad Jamie would be with his family, and he was glad Jack would reunite with those peculiar friends he talked about. His family. He had to focus on that. The crystal lay in the snow, casting a faint blue glimmer across the white. They walked up to it, but nobody tried to touch it. "Maybe I get that you control the weather just now," Hiccup said, "but I know I'm going to find this crystal tomorrow. If I touch it and it disappears..." Jack nodded slowly, wearing that same absent frown. "That's what we need," he muttered after a few seconds, so quietly Hiccup almost didn't hear him. He took a steadying breath and turned to look at them. "We can't change time in these visions. Each time we've managed to interact with anything, it hasn't changed how we remember the past. But this is definitely the same crystal, right? So, if we touch this, it'll mess things up. It'll create a tear in time." He looked back at the crystal. Though his words were confident, his expression told another story. "I'm not going to pretend I know exactly how it works, but Freya said this one would be the last. When we touch this crystal, I don't think it'll take Jamie, Babytooth, and I back to Berk." There was silence. Hiccup realized they'd come to a point of no return. The only way to wake up from this vision was to touch the crystal. Jamie said, his voice thin. "I'll be over there meanwhile. Come on, Babytooth." And he ran off, disappearing into the woods. Hiccup would have laughed if he hadn't felt so miserable. "Won't you get lost?" he asked, staring at the trees instead of meeting Jack's eyes. "Hopefully not," Jack said. His voice was soft, flat. "But either way, one of us has to touch the crystal to wake us up." "Oh, yeah." Silence again. Jack shifted, touching Hiccup's hand. He turned to him, but kept his eyes trained somewhere on the ground to his left, his mouth a thin line. Hiccup intertwined their fingers and squeezed. Several seconds passed before any of them said anything. I've thought of this moment many times," Hiccup murmured, keeping his voice down to steady it. "What to say and all. Whole mental speeches, but now I've forgotten all of it." He tried chuckling, but it came out as dry and joyless. "Should probably hurry up before Jamie gets impatient," Jack said, glancing up at him with something of a smile, but the moment he did, his posture began breaking. A tremor went across his face, and he lowered his eyes to Hiccup's collarbones. He let out a shaky breath. "I'm not," he started, voice thin. I'm not gonna cry, because Jamie doesn't need to see that." Hiccup glanced at the forest, wondering if Jamie was eavesdropping, but decided he wouldn't do that. "He'd understand," he told Jack. "He would, but you know how he is," Jack said, laughing unsteadily. "No, that'll have to wait, and you—" He looked up again with serious, tear-rimmed eyes. "You can't cry either, because then I'll definitely break and it'll all be over." Hiccup tried smiling. "Okay, I won't," he said, though he wasn't sure if he'd be able to keep that promise. Jack nodded and closed his eyes. "Good," he whispered, then pulled Hiccup into a hug. Immediately, Hiccup had to wipe a tear from his own cheek before putting his arms around Jack and pressing his face into his hair. Since none of them seemed to be able to come up with any heartfelt speeches or confessions of eternal love or whatever it was Hiccup wanted to say or hear, they stayed like that, in silence, for a while. Jack's breath was shallow. Hiccup felt him trying to even it out, but he still shook with it. "I don't think I'll forget." Hiccup's mind was so foggy he wasn't sure if he'd actually said it out loud or not. But Jack went still and pulled away just enough to look at him. "You have to forget," he said softly. "Or else—" "I know," Hiccup said, shifting his weight to his prosthetic. He studied Jack's face and shook his head. "I know I have to forget, and maybe that is what's going to happen, but I can't make it make sense in my head." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" Hiccup didn't know exactly what he meant. Instead of replying, he leaned down and kissed Jack softly and unhurriedly while he still could. He didn't open his eyes. "It's just not something you forget," he said. "Doesn't seem possible. Maybe I'll forget the magic, but I won't forget you." He raised his voice at the end without meaning to. He opened his eyes to see Jack staring at him like he was speaking a different language. Hiccup put a hand on his cheek. "I won't forget you," he repeated. "I won't." Jack opened his mouth, then closed it again. His shoulders rose and fell with each breath. "You have to live," he managed to whisper. "I will," Hiccup said. "I promise." "You can't have both," Jack said, and then lost the battle against the tears, a couple of them trailing down his cheeks. "We can't have both." Hiccup carefully wiped his cheeks. He leaned forward, gently pressing his forehead to Jack's. "We'll be fine," he said. Jack sniffled. "Are you saying that just so it'll be easier to leave?" he asked, pulling away to wipe his face on his sleeve. Hiccup considered it before shaking his head. "Things always turn out fine somehow. Trust me." Jack peered at him as if he was trying to detect a lie before his face broke into a genuine smile. "Okay, I trust you," he said. He tilted his head up and kissed him again. Then he took a step back and inhaled deeply. "I'll call for Jamie now." Hiccup just nodded and spent the seconds it took Jamie to find his way back to them, trying to steady his breathing. While Jack and Hiccup had spent most of their willpower holding their tears back, Jamie seemed to understand that they were ready to leave, and immediately broke down in sobs. He hugged Hiccup tightly, hanging onto him so fiercely Hiccup had to sit down. "It's okay," he said feebly, stroking Jamie's back. "Don't think about leaving. Think about the good moments." He wasn't sure if Jamie heard him. Eventually, Jamie managed to calm down enough to stop sobbing, and he pulled away. Jack smiled sadly, ruffling his hair. "Time to go," he said. "Take care of Squawk," Jamie said. And give my sword to Hildur. She said she wasn't jealous, but I could tell that she was." Hiccup held back a laugh. "Will do," he said. He wondered if he would remember. He wondered what his brain would make of the sword at all, without Jamie in the picture. Babytooth flew up to Hiccup's face. She said something, then touched his forehead, and Hiccup looked to Jack for translation. "She says she's glad to have been your friend," Jack said, "and that she's sorry." Hiccup looked back at her, and suddenly felt very bad for all the time he'd spent being wary of her. He shook his head and held up his hand. "You don't have to be sorry," he told her. Babytooth touched the tip of his finger, smiled shyly, then darted away to sit on Jack's shoulder. They sat down in a circle around the crystal, just like they'd done in Hiccup's bedroom moments earlier. Jack took Jamie's hand. I have a feeling this might get a little bumpy, he explained. So, hold on tightly. Jamie nodded nervously. Then Jack took Hiccup's hand too and raised it to his lips. Hiccup looked steadily back at him, trying to silently convey what he'd said earlier. He nodded, and Jack slowly let go of his hand, moving it over to the crystal. Hovering there, Jack exhaled slowly. He started. He looked up at Hiccup, his lips trembling with unspoken words. Then he smiled softly. Goodbye, Hiccup. Hiccup didn't know how he was able to find his voice. Goodbye, he whispered, and Jack's hand locked around the crystal. Hiccup woke up on the floor of his bedroom. He pushed himself up, looking around blearily. Outside, the moon was high in the sky. Toothless was sleeping beside him, only opening one eye when he heard Hiccup move. If he thought it was strange that Hiccup had joined him on the floor, he didn't show it. He dragged a hand over his face. His body felt like he'd been beaten up. What kind of flying maneuvers had he been practicing lately to make him this stiff? Or was he still healing from the training drill? Yeah, that was it. He remembered they'd been in some trouble back there. Some sort of unidentifiable dragon had attacked him. It had been rough since he was still healing from it. He must have hit his head too, because the memory was pretty foggy. He got to his feet, holding back a groan as he did. Outside, the village was silent. He'd been exhausted all day, but it was still weird that he'd passed out on the floor. Maybe he was coming down with something. He looked out the window, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe if he stared long enough, he'd figure out why he felt like something was missing. A breeze blew into the room, and there was a sound of something sweeping across the floor behind him. He turned around and saw the edge of something white peeking out from under his bed. He was about to ignore it, probably just an old sketch of his, but another gust of wind blew the paper out onto the floor. Hiccup stared at it. Slowly, he walked over and picked it up. "That's weird," he murmured. Toothless's nose bumped against Hiccup's elbow. He hadn't heard him get up, and he showed him the drawing, as if Toothless would be able to explain what the artist, whoever it was, because it definitely wasn't Hiccup, had used to draw with all these vibrant colors. The material the page was made out of was strange as well. Toothless gave a soft whine, like he was asking a question. He stared at Hiccup in a way that seemed strangely meaningful. Just like the drawing, inexplicably, seemed oddly familiar.